when you were talking about the descriptions, how to handle descriptions, you don't have the gruff detective talking about his steely gray eyes. And that is just totally off the topic of point of view, but on description specifically. So in Anne Kinnear 4, I'm finding that there are some characters that I either need to or want to describe right away. So, for example, it's important that one of the characters is physically large. For the purposes of the story, it's important that he's physically large. So I describe him as being like a physically large guy. And then it's also important for another character that on the surface, she seemed not standoffish and cold. And then another character seems warm and motherly. So I have descriptions of those characters. And in fact, in most of those cases, to make sure I'm consistent about the descriptions, I found pictures of actors or actresses that I can use to say, oh, are their eyes blue or green? Oh, it's green. I can look at the picture of whoever it is I've picked out. And then there are other characters that I don't really feel the need to describe at all, other than, well, in some cases, hardly at all. So in the current draft, I just have some characters that here they are, and they're not described very much, and other characters that are described a lot. So how important do you think consistency of detail of description is across characters?
I think that you have a lot of leeway. You know, the things that I would be cautious about are like when you describe a character in great detail, you might be doing it as the author, you might be doing it because one or more of those details is going to become very relevant at some point. And the reader needs to know that. But by describing them in detail, you're also giving the reader a signal that this is an important character. And when the reader's kind of like, who do I need to pay attention to? Who's important? Who's not? Who's going to figure into things? You're signaling them that is a more important character. And the corollary to that is that if there's another character who you barely describe at all, you're signaling to the reader, especially if you're describing some characters and not others, you're signaling to the reader that this other character is going to be less important. And that might or might not be the case. And if that is the case, then it's fine. But if it's not the case, then you might want to say, oh, I normally wouldn't go into such great detail describing this character, but because I have described these other characters, I don't want to give this character short shrift because I want the reader to know that this is going to be an important character, and I need to bring them up on a par. The other thing is that, just you want to be careful about is that if toward well into the book, if a detail comes to the fore about this character, some sort of descriptive detail, the thing you have to watch out for, if you don't describe the character, the reader is going to plug in those details on some level. If you never describe the character, then that's not a problem. But if you introduce a character on page 25 and then start giving us details on page 115, then the reader is going to have to recalibrate and rethink and it's hard enough to get them to picture these characters as real people anyway.
That was my second question, that exact thing about when you introduce a description later and the reader goes, no, wait, they have red hair?
Exactly. And that kind of jarringness or jar or whatever, I don't know what the right version of that, but kind of tension or conflict that can just sit in the reader's head for the rest of the book. And every time that character comes up, they have this little, and that's taking them out of the narrative. That's taking them out of the story. You're confusing their understanding of it and putting some distance between them and the work, which you never want to do.
I think that the tricky part there is that I totally agree. I find it very jarring when I've developed that picture in my mind of the character and then the author tells me it's something different. But then against that, you have to weigh, if you're meeting 3 new characters, then it's also awkward to pack in 3 character descriptions early so that you're getting to the reader before they're developing their own. Like the first woman who walked into the room looked like this, and then the second woman looked like this, and then the guy looked like this. And do you have any thoughts about that? Like when you're introducing a group of characters at once, how to handle that those pulls.
Yeah. I think it's a challenge when you're introducing a group of characters at the same time. I think ideally you want to break it up, and you can't always. Sometimes you can't. I think that if you can't, if they are a group and you encounter them as a group, then I think that it makes sense in that case to just say the door opened and two women walked in, followed by a guy, and then you can have dialogue, said the first woman. She had, and describe her. Or just they walked in and described them. And sometimes it depends on the narrative, it depends on the point of view character, it depends on the situation. If you have a very tense situation and your protagonist knows that maybe they're in danger or they could be or whatever, they're on heightened alert, and three characters walk in, it will be very naturalistic for the point of view character to describe those three characters, because they're going to be attuned to those details. They're trying to figure out who they're dealing with. The part that's really tricky is when you introduce characters, multiple characters, you have to be really careful that you don't give the reader any opportunity for confusion. That you really are very careful that that there's absolute clarity, because that's one of those things where, holy shit, 60 pages, excuse me. I don't know. I just got you an explicit.
It's only for the Patreon people, so that's okay.
Okay, there you go. If 50 pages later they realize they conflated them, then that's just devastating to the relationship, to the work, and the understanding of what's going on, and the perception of the characters, all that stuff. I think that's one of those, as I said earlier, I think that clarity has to trump style. And I try very hard to avoid any like info dumps and chunks of exposition in my writing, but sometimes you just have to, and that might be when. Now, so that said, the other thing that you can do is give each of them one descriptor that you can tag them with, that's almost like a name, especially if you don't know the names yet, which you probably don't if they're just walking in and the point of view character doesn't know them or whatever. Giving them each one thing that you can tag them with. And I will say that this is the kind of thing that when you are conceptualizing your characters, when you're in the early stages, when you're figuring out what your story is going to be and who your characters are going to be, keep in mind that you're going to want to be able to differentiate them. You might have a great idea for a story, and it's about these four young men who all went to the same prep school, and they all came from the same background. They all grew up in the same. That's going to be the more similar you make your characters, the harder it is to differentiate them. And if there's not a compelling reason for them to be so similar, you will be doing yourself a big favor by making them more different, so that they're easier to differentiate, so that they're easier for the reader to keep track of. And it can be more interesting just having a more diverse cast of characters. But those are the kinds of things that, like, what you might want to do is, oh, you know what? I'm going to give this character a limp, or a glass eye, or a mustache, or a pierced nose, or whatever. Give them these things that, but you don't want to be cheesy about it. You don't want to be silly about it, but you can give them these physical tags that will make it easy for the reader to differentiate them from the get-go. And then in the subsequent page or 2 pages or 5 pages or paragraph or whatever, then you can expand on the description, but you've already differentiated them. And I think that's important.
I think you could also make use of superficial similarities, because you could say something like, the 3 people walked in all looking like they bought their clothes from the same Brook Brothers store. And then, so you've already established, in one line, you've established something about the appearance of the 3 of them. And then in subsequent discussion, you could get more into the observing those differences, which then differentiates the characters more.
Yeah, the thing you need to be careful about with a technique like that is making sure that nothing important that is character specific has been done before they've been differentiated.
Yeah.
You don't want to say these 3 characters came in, they looked like they went to Brook Brothers together to get their suits or whatever, one of them says, "We're here to kill you," and then the other one says, "Hold on a second," and then you start to differentiate them. That's like a huge difference between those characters. And if you do that before you have given the reader these tags or these identifiers that they can keep track of them, then they're not going to know who's who, and they're not going to know henceforth who it was. They're going to have to, and you know, even if you tell them, they're going to be trying to figure it out until it's clear. And if they're trying to figure that out, maybe that's intentional. Maybe you want them to be doing that. Maybe you want them to be trying to figure that out so that they don't notice something else that you've slipped in there that's going to be important later, but that you don't want them to pick up on right away because it's a hidden clue or whatever. But if it's not intentional, one of the things that I think a lot of writers don't fully appreciate is like the kind of the opportunity cost of what, you know, of lack of clarity of what if you're not clear about certain things, if you leave things overly vague, the reader's going to be wondering about them and parsing it and trying to figure that out. And if they're doing that, they're not going to be doing other things. They're going to be distracted, and they might not pick up on things that you want them to pick up on because they're important to the narrative. And then you're doing yourself a disservice. A lot of writers have this, a lot of writers that I work with have this tendency to introduce a character or to have a character enter the narrative and then not introduce them for a half a page or whatever. And I think like in the writing of it, it feels subtle or sophisticated, but I don't think it really brings anything to the narrative. I don't think it comes across as subtle or sophisticated to the reader, but in the meantime, they're wondering who the hell it is.
Yeah.
And one of the things, again, there's the signaling is important. If you say in the middle of a novel, this character shows up and you don't introduce them when they first arrive, you're signaling to the reader that they should already know this character. And then a lot of times the reader's going to stop and start flicking back and what did I miss? What did I miss? And they're like, I can't find it 10 minutes later. And then they keep reading. And then 3 paragraphs down, that character is introduced.
Yeah.
And it's a new character. That's like a terrible assault on the reading experience. So that's something that totally takes the character out of the book, literally. They're flicking the pages. So I think you really need to think carefully about what are the unintended consequences of these things. What are you causing the reader to do, and what detriment might that have on the reading experience?
Yep. Cool. That's great. That's great Patreon info. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now.